My fellow Americans, welcome to The Celluloid President, the podcast about American presidents on film. Today we're discussing Christopher Nolan's Oppenheimer, which, although it's essentially a biopic about the father of the atomic bomb, it does get to the essence of our 33rd president, Harry Truman.
I, Harry S Truman, do solemnly swear. You will faithfully execute the office of President of the United States. That I will faithfully execute the office of President of the United States. And will, to the best of your ability. And will, to the best of my ability. Preserve, protect, and defend the Constitution of the United States. Preserve, protect, and defend the Constitution of the United States.
I'm Gary Holmes, and joining me today via Zoom from California is Jim Robinson, who is definitely not a crybaby who needs to be banned from the Oval Office. Jim, do you think of yourself as death and the destroyer of worlds?
Well, Gary, you and I have both spent most of our lives voting for Republicans. So, of course, we're the destroyers of worlds and the destroyers of democracy while we're at it.
Yeah, speak for yourself and see if you can say that in Sanskrit too. All right. So since this podcast is about American presidents, let's spend just a few minutes talking about Harry Truman, who just has a small part in this movie. And then we can focus on Oppenheimer, the movie, and the man. Truman was already out of office when we were born, so we didn't have much direct experience with him. But what is your take on him?
Well, I look at Truman sort of the way I look at LBJ, which is both presidents really rose to the occasion when they suddenly and shockingly became president and performed in an exemplary fashion in their opening months. After that, not so great. But if you look at what Truman especially inherited after being basically vice president for only a few months, I mean, we could have done a lot worse as a country. And if you look at the nincompoops that have been vice president throughout our entire history, I really think we kind of lucked out in
Or
having him there.
Even the vice president before him, Henry Wallace, would have been a terrible president. I mean, he was basically
Exactly.
a communist.
Yeah, and look at who our greatest president of all time, Abraham Lincoln, chose as his vice president.
Right.
So I think the country was very, very fortunate to have Truman in those awful, consequential months of 1945.
Yeah, I don't know if you even remember Truman when we were growing up.
Well, I remember when he died,
Yeah.
and he died a month before LBJ died. And I remembered an almost comical scene of, Truman's 30 days of the flags at half staff hadn't ended yet. So they rolled the flags back up to full staff and then immediately lowered them again for another 30 days because LBJ had just died. And so I sort of remember that. And I remember it was one of the few times in history at that point when there were no living ex-presidents.
Okay.
So I remember that. I also remember that a lot of people around me and history teachers by that time had really adopted Truman as a folk hero. And he became quite a hero in many people's eyes. I'd also remind you that one of our own bosses, Congressman Jerry Solomon, absolutely loved Harry Truman and often pointed to Truman as a role model. Jerry had been a Democrat,
Yeah.
in the 1960s, and then became a conservative Republican. So it was mainly through history lessons, through the folklore, through what other people were saying about Truman, how they were kind of lionizing him for his plain spokenness, that I remember Truman.
Yeah. So for those of you who haven't been fortunate enough to read my memoir, Unfortunate Son, which is still available on Amazon, Jim and I both worked for this congressman, fairly right-wing congressman in upstate New York named Jerry Solomon. And actually, I did not know that he was a Truman fan until now. So anyway, I became aware of Truman in the late 60s when he was having a bit of a renaissance because the writer Merle Miller who'd interviewed Truman in 1962 for a TV documentary that never aired, starting writing magazine articles about his interviews, portraying Truman as kind of a common sense sage. Truman was long known for being plain spoken, which is a polite way of saying it, because if he didn't like someone, he'd say he was a crook, too damn dumb, not right in his head, etc. But in these articles that Miller wrote, he claimed Truman was also basically a self-educated scholar of history. When Truman left when Truman left office in 1953, he was the most unpopular president in history, more unpopular than even Trump or Biden are today. It's also worth noting that those were the days when party leaders could tell a sitting president not to run for reelection, so he didn't. And they nominated Adlai Stevenson instead. Anyway, thanks to revisionist historians like Miller and others, he's now considered one of the better presidents. As you mentioned, he became president right after Roosevelt died in 1945, completely unprepared for the job, but he oversaw the end of World War II, the dropping of the atomic bomb, and the Cold War. So I think in foreign affairs, he was actually quite a good president, better than FDR, who was soft on Stalin, but kind of a failure domestically. We
Well,
remember,
if you look at what he had to do within 2 or 3 months of taking office, he had to go over to Potsdam,
right?
to Germany, to have what was arguably the most important and most complicated summit with the Russians, with Stalin, and with the Brits, and the Brits had just voted out Churchill, so it was this bizarre situation where Churchill was the representative in the first half of the summit. Summit went on forever, and then he left and was replaced right mid-summit, and Truman had to handle all that. What he didn't handle well, it was domestic
Yeah,
issues, and especially the winding down of the wartime economy to the domestic economy, which was going to be difficult for anyone anyway. You had all these pent up demands for salary increases, you had huge supply chain issues that were huge and that dwarf anything we experienced during the COVID aftermath. So it was those kinds of issues that he didn't handle so well. I read McCullough's book on Truman.
okay,
That's sort of the seminal biography,
yeah.
and I'd recommend that to anybody who really wants to understand Truman. He really was a remarkable figure. And by the way, he was an absolute war hero in World War I, and which would inform his decision making in terms of the atomic bomb, which we'll get to.
With that as background, I'll do a quick summary of the movie, so that we know what we're talking about for those of you who haven't seen it. Anyway, Oppenheimer is essentially a biopic about the life of J. Robert Oppenheimer, the so-called father of the atomic bomb. It's to the credit of director Christopher Nolan that he's managed to turn a movie about people in classrooms, laboratories, and meeting rooms talking about quantum physics into a 3-hour epic blockbuster. The story is told by intricate cross-cutting across 3 different storylines. The first is about how Oppenheimer became director of the Manhattan Project that developed the atomic bomb and the immediate aftermath of the use of the bomb on Hiroshima and Nagasaki. The second story strand revolves around a hearing several years later in which Oppenheimer was stripped of his security clearance because of his outspoken left-wing views and former association with American communists. And the third story strand involves the 1959 confirmation hearing for Oppenheimer's bitter antagonist, Louis Strauss, who'd orchestrated Oppenheimer's downfall and came to pay the price for it. All 3 stories are presented to us simultaneously, so there's a lot of complicated time switching. At the heart of all 3 stories, though, is Oppenheimer's character. He's ambitious enough to compromise his principles, but still personally conflicted over his role in developing the bomb. He basically wants to have his cake and eat it too, but ends up falling between the character cracks. He wants to be morally virtuous and still craves the power and influence that comes with being the big shot insider. The movie shows how Oppenheimer was briefly the most famous man in the world, and then run out of government. And it ends with him and a somewhat broken man being awarded the Presidential Medal of Honor by LBJ. There's a lot
Yeah,
more, a
you
lot
did
more.
pretty well though for a 3 hour movie, Barry. I mean, did audiences sit through this 3 hour movie?
Well, as you know, it was a massive hit. Since its release last summer, it's earned almost $1 billion, about a third of which was in the US and two-thirds from international markets. It was the third highest grossing movie of the year, losing only to Barbie and Super Mario Brothers. Remarkable for a 3 hour R-rated biopic about quantum physics, it beat out the latest offerings from franchise movies like Mission Impossible, Indiana Jones, Guardians of the Galaxy, and Spider-Man. It's been nominated for 13 Academy Award nominations, including Best Picture, Best Director, Best Supporting Actor, and Actress, and it's a clear favorite to win the Best Picture. So I would say people responded to it well.
What I'm wondering, and you're much more in tune with what's going on in cinema than I am, does this signal a kind of the downfall of the action hero movie and the sequels movies? I mean, what do you make of this movie being so successful?
Yeah, that's what they're saying. I mean, the top movie of the year was Barbie, which was a completely original movie. Everyone was expecting that it would be popular, but no one guessed that it would be that popular. The Mario Brothers movie is a surprise. Also, it's not really a franchise, even though it's based on previous intellectual property, which is a video game. So yeah, I think the takeaway from the year was that people really are tired of franchises. Mission Impossible was a little bit of a disappointment, and the superhero movies in particular were taking a hit. I think Marvel has just run those into the ground, and I think people are just tired of them. That they're tired and they want to get. This is the takeaway, which we can all hope is the case, that they're interested in getting back to original movies.
Yeah, I've been reading some articles and commentary about, Marvel and some of the actual bombs that are coming out.
Yeah.
Huge disappointments. I read a funny quote of a film critic who doesn't really like hasn't really enjoyed the trend toward superhero and comic book movies. He said, actors start on the indie circuit and end up in front of green screens wearing underpants outside their clothes. I thought that was a great commentary. But I'm really heartened by the success of this movie, even
Yeah.
though, as will become apparent, I have some complaints about it. But
All right.
I think it would be great if we could get back to more of these kinds of movies.
Well, are you familiar with Christopher Nolan at all? Have you seen his movies?
No, not very familiar, except knowing that he's a huge success. I haven't seen any of the Dark Knight trilogy, for example, because it's the kind of movie that I generally don't care for in those films. How about yourself?
Well, I have seen The Dark Knight, and I actually don't remember how many of the Batman movies I've seen because I've seen quite a few different Batman movies. I've seen some of them. The Dark Knight is considered to be the greatest of all the superhero movies, just because of the quality of the direction and the moral complexity of the story and all that kind of stuff. I've also seen Dunkirk, which is a story about the the evacuation of the British troops from Dunkirk during World War II, and I think that's a great movie. I mean, I really love that movie. His other movies are things like Interstellar, Inception, Tenet. They're all long. They're all imaginative. A lot of it's about my memory, about my time travel and that kind of thing. So he's not exactly my cup of tea, but all his movies are really, really popular. And this one I think is kind of amazing considering how long it is and how complicated it is.
Well, one thing's for sure is Universal sure looks like geniuses for grabbing hold of Nolan, because I did read that he had been with Warner Brothers and this was his first project for Universal.
Oh boy.
So
Yeah.
somebody's going to get a big bonus in the executive offices of
Um,
Universal.
Now, I don't know where to put this, but I need to bring it up. So I'll do it here. The story of the making of the atomic bomb was told once before in 1989 in a movie called Fat Man and Little Boy. And Paul Newman played Leslie Groves, the general in this. And the movie is told largely from his perspective. Oppenheimer is played by Dwight Schultz, who's probably best known as Captain Howling Mad Murdoch on the I-Team, a show that I didn't watch, so I'm not familiar with who Dwight Schultz is. And I've actually seen this movie and don't remember much about it. So, and
Well, I've never seen it, but I always assume that anything that comes out of Hollywood has already been made at least once before.
yeah, it was fine, I guess. Obviously didn't have the high concept stuff here. So, Jim, we both studied history in college and remained students of American history since then. How much of this movie was new to you?
Quite a bit, actually, but in the way that a lot of Selma was new to me, the film that
Yeah,
we
yeah,
discussed
yeah,
about the civil rights movement. I knew the broad parameters, I knew the major decision points, but I didn't know the tick-tock of events and developments as they unfolded. So I found it hugely educational.
yeah. Same here. I mean, obviously heard of the Manhattan Project. I knew about Oppenheimer himself, but not much about him. I knew that there was some loyalty controversy, and I also knew that Klaus Fuchs worked at the Los Alamos lab and was the spy for the communists. But that's it. I never heard of Louis Strauss before. That was
Are you sure you pronounced Fuchs properly?
well, you know,
It's spelled Fuchs. There you have it, audience.
yeah, pronunciation of words becomes a big thing with some of these characters. I mean, Louis Strauss, it makes a big deal about saying his name is actually pronounced Straws, so that it doesn't sound.
People wouldn't think he was Jewish. Yeah.
Yeah, I'd also heard. I took a physics class, so I knew in high school, so I knew a lot of the scientists in the movie. Albert Einstein, of course, but also Niels Bohr, Edward Teller, and Enrico Fermi. So it was fun to see them portrayed. I mean, those are names that and it's weird also when you think about those guys, how famous scientists used to be. That nothing like that today. I mean, I
Right.
can't even name a famous scientist, and you would think, like, can you even name the father of the COVID vaccine? No, of course
No.
not. No.
It's Donald Trump, isn't it?
Mike
I
Pence.
mean, when I hear him talk about it, he obviously put on a white coat and a visor and was in the laboratory working at all hours. But anyway,
Uh,
how many times have you seen this movie? Did you see it
Seen
in
it
the
twice.
theaters?
No, yeah. So I was lucky enough to see it in the IMAX theater, which is this giant screen, and the ideal best way to do it. And I think it actually affects how you think about the movie, how you watch it. I found it absorbing and thrilling, although a little bit confusing. And then when we prepared for this podcast, I watched it at home with the subtitles on, which helped a lot with better understanding the specifics of the plot. So I just think it's a remarkable achievement. Again, the idea that a movie like this could be so popular is just amazing and a tribute to Nolan. I mean, what did you think? Did you like it? Yeah, I know you didn't.
Well,
You didn't go to the theater.
no, I didn't go to the theater, and I started my viewing at home with a built-in prejudice, and that is that it was 3 hours. I
Yeah,
like my movies to be 90 minutes. I'll even shy away from 2 hours. There's no rationality to that.
yeah. No, no, I
It's
know.
just the way I am. It basically held my interest. When the test was successful in New Mexico, and it was seemed to me like the climax of the movie.
Yeah,
And I looked at my watch and there
yeah.
was still an hour to go. I thought, my God, what are they going to do for another hour? But with a few looks at the clock, it held my interest. I have to say that one reason why I'm not sure that the IMAX experience would have enhanced my viewing is that I found it a little disconcerting when it flipped from being a period piece movie set in World War II to almost like those sci-fi intermixes when
Oh,
he was
right.
imagining a physical phenomenon and space age science fiction kind of things acting out in his mind. I found that jarring, and I found that removed me from the historical period piece atmosphere that had been created for me in the rest of the movie. So I'm not sure. I bet you the IMAX experience enhanced those snippets,
Yeah,
but
it
I
really
didn't
did.
care. But I didn't care for them. So
Yeah, I mean, the thing about when you're in an IMAX theater is that everything is so overwhelming, and it really does. I mean, these are kind of special effects that Jim's talking about with, like atoms and it's big picture things and it does it overwhelms you and so it works. I think it does work better in IMAX. The bigger the
well, I do.
screen, the
Yeah.
more immersive the experience is going to be anyway. I mean,
Now I do admire the ambition there. I admire the ambition of trying to make physical science into art,
right.
into a thing of beauty. And um, and I'll just point out at the get-go, I thought the music really helped. The
Oh
music
yeah.
was phenomenal throughout the movie, not just, the incidental music and the background music. And I believe its music's been nominated for one of
Yeah,
the
the music
Oscars.
is great. And also, I'm not usually as well aware of the sound editing, but, there were like elements that you would hear throughout the movie to signal a certain thing that was going on. Like there's especially the stomping that takes place after they've dropped the bomb and the scientists are in an auditorium and they're stomping their feet. You hear that both beforehand, like an hour before that happens, and then you hear it afterwards too. And it's very eerie. So that's an example of how good sound
Yeah.
that this is the kind of thing
Yeah.
if when you see a movie the second time, it's like, oh, I know what that is. I was just gonna
Well,
say, what specifically did you like?
well, I certainly like the fact that it was made and that it was a success, as we've discussed. I like that it was about an event of genuine historical importance. I contrast that a little bit with Amistad, the Steven
Yeah,
Spielberg movie, which I really liked. But I think you and I both agreed it tended to inflate the story of those Africans, seeking their freedom as being inflated with too much historical importance.
right.
This way, there's no way you can inflate the historical importance of the first atom bomb and the dropping of it. I like the fact that some protagonist was not a cardboard cutout hero. He was definitely a flawed man. He wasn't really even that likable as a
Mhm.
person, and he was kind of a mess, but he was still definitely someone that was a genius and that had played a huge role in history. I think, on balance, a positive role. So I like that about the movie. And I like that it presented as a paradox, the development of the atom bomb. What did
Yeah.
you like?
Well, I liked that it required and rewarded sustained, intense attention. You couldn't let your mind wander, and you didn't want to because of this masterful way it was edited and kept your attention. I appreciated that it assumed I was an intelligent human being and could follow the many ideas that I was being exposed to. I don't know a lot about physics, but I was able to follow the discussion, or at least the movie made me think I could, and that made me feel smart. So I always like going to a movie and then coming out feeling, oh, I'm kind of a smart person because I understood that.
Yeah, it raised I think it raised all the dilemmas
And yeah,
of the discovery and the development of the bomb. Didn't resolve them, but raised them.
and it doesn't really
And
put its hands on the scale either, right? It doesn't say that that Oppenheimer was a big hero, that Truman was a hero or a villain. I mean, whatever, it was very nuanced all the way out, all the
yeah,
way
who
through.
were the heroes? And that's a good question. Were there any heroes in this movie? I'm not so sure. I'll tell you another thing I really appreciated about the movie was that it didn't hide the fact that there really was a communist movement in the country,
Yeah,
and that there really was a traitor among them. And again, a purely liberal filmmaker might have tried to present the Red Scare as totally a concoction
right.
of paranoid right wingers, instead of pointing out that there were plenty of homegrown communists amidst us. And then, of course, the legitimate questions were, how much do you allow them to function in society? And I think we got some of it right and got some of it wrong during McCarthyism.
Yeah, well, I know I appreciated, for example, then I watched it the second time. I realized this, like the Matt Damon character, the general who's in charge of things, keeps wanting to keep the scientists separated, and so that they're in silos, so they can't, for security reasons. And in the movie, kind of, or the scientists are like they refuse to do it, and they keep undermining him. Well, then in the end, it turns out he was right because they had a total communist spy there, Klaus Fuchs, and because he was able to get all the information because he wasn't kept in a silo. So,
Right.
there was legitimate concern for being concerned, and maybe they overdid it, and they showed actually how they overdo it. But that's human nature. I mean, societies always swing from one thing to another, and when it's over, you think, "Geez, why did we do that?" I thought the depiction of Oppenheimer was really one of the most complex I'd ever seen in a biopic. It showed both his intellectual strengths and his personal weaknesses. Matt Damon, as a general, Groves describes him as, quote, a dilettante, a womanizer, a suspected communist, unstable, theatrical, egotistical, and neurotic. And that's a pretty accurate summation. So we admire him for what he accomplishes, and wince at his flaws, including his arrogance, his unfaithfulness, and his thirst for power. And it does remind you that people are complicated people. I mean, you usually don't get such a sophisticated rendering of the protagonist of a major major motion picture.
Yeah, I thought it actually tilted on the side of making him not likable and not a hero. And
Yeah,
not that he was a villain, but that he was not a hero. I mean, he was pretty vain and arrogant and full of himself. And I do just have to point out the irony after he spent years and years wondering what he had created and sort of kicking off, initiating the atomic age and the potential that we would all die in a nuclear holocaust. And the irony that he died at only age 62 of throat cancer after incredible chronic smoking his whole life, long after or well after the science had already proved
right,
that smoking could kill you. I mean, that's a little nasty on my part, but it is sort of ironic, don't you think?
right, 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 right. You're right. The smoking has killed a lot more people than the atomic bomb has.
That's for
Um,
sure.
all right. What didn't you like?
Well, I'm not as smart as you.
Okay, I know,
So,
but yeah,
so, so I found the flipping back and forth to different hearings
yeah,
and back, I thought that was kind of confusing. Which hearing are we back in now? His security clearance hearing, Strauss's confirmation hearing, the deliberations of the Atomic Energy Commission. I mean, where are we?
right.
I just found it got confusing and tiresome. And so that's one of the things that I didn't like. Did you really follow all that?
I guess I am smarter than you. Yeah, finally, after all these years, I'm smarter at something than you are. I guess I had been warned ahead of time, so I was paying attention to that from the beginning. One of the benefits, I guess, of reading like 25 reviews of a movie before you go is you kind of know what the plot is. So I was aware that there were these three strands of stories. I mean, did try to keep them apart by making one period in black and white, one in muted, and one in regular color. So yeah, but I agree. I agree. That was hard to follow, and you really had to be paying close attention. And it helped a lot that I saw it a second time and was able to, follow it from the beginning. And as I said, it helped a lot too on the second time around that I was able to watch it with closed captioning because I need those subtitles these days.
Well, the other thing is, my other complaint is, I think it did kind of go off the rails in the last third of the movie. I think it had its own little built-in identity crisis. What did this movie want to be after it so wonderfully and dramatically and thrillingly showed the successful test in New Mexico,
Yeah.
and that the scientists, including Oppenheimer, had done their job and were going to actually help us win the war. Um, did it want to be a movie of tongue clucking at the Red Scare and the overreaction of the anti-communist movement? I don't know. I just think it lost its way a little bit, and I think it inflated the importance of the security clearance hearing. Like, so what? I mean, Oppenheimer was still a national figure on the cover of magazines, would carry enormous sway going forward as one of the most famous people in the country. And it made this huge histrionic significance out of whether or not he would continue to have a government clearance. Whereas we've learned many times since, there weren't that many secrets in government that were closely held anyway. So I thought it kind of lost its way.
Yeah, I know what you mean. It kind of, in a movie like this, like where do you end it? And they decided to make it into a straight biopic. So they followed him through the rest of his life, even though the climax happened. And I guess he wanted to make the point that that Oppenheimer had qualms about what he'd created afterwards. So, okay, you could have gone another 5 years into his life and all that issue. The I didn't have a problem with that. The hearing about Strauss not getting his Department of Commerce confirmation is like
Eh,
really stretching it, though. I mean, you're kidding me, right? I mean, we're talking about a confirmation hearing for the Department of Commerce. I guess it was important back then. I mean, it was like I mean,
well, it hadn't happened I
I
think,
know.
in
And
the
it didn't happen
century.
again until John Tower, during the Bush administration, first Bush.
Yeah.
But it's just so ridiculous that 40 minutes of a major picture is about a confirmation hearing for a commerce secretary. I mean, I don't even know who the commerce secretary is now. Do you? I'm sure you don't.
No.
I mean,
Well, I think they were hemmed in. I think Nolan hemmed himself in by making this a biopic,
yeah,
and he made a brilliant one. But there were much more important issues into the 1950s that could have been explored. Now they did explore the hydrogen bomb issue. Do we launch that after launching the atomic bomb? They did explore the issue of when do we try to gain international cooperation instead of just trusting each nation that develops a bomb to its own devices. And that was a legitimate issue. And by the way, people like Eisenhower were more on Oppenheimer's side on that than on the other side. And there were occasions during the 1950s where Eisenhower was presented with specific proposals by his generals to use the atomic bomb 3 separate times. And he said, no way. And so there were more earth shattering issues stemming out of what Oppenheimer had achieved. But because this was about Oppenheimer,
yeah.
we sort of got stuck with a confirmation hearing and a hearing about whether he would have a badge saying security clearance or not.
Yeah,
That's
no,
my
and
complaint.
you're completely right. When you're doing a biopic, you can't really go into all those other issues. And I think the reason it ends basically with the confirmation hearing is because it gives the audience the emotional satisfaction of seeing this guy taken down.
Yes.
You come out of the movie like, yeah, that guy got what he deserved, and then we feel better about you feel like there's a little justice in the world. So there's a little bit of a happy ending tacked on, but you have to go through the hearing to get it. So I,
I do think another complaint is I do think the motives of some of the people in the film were not drawn as sharply as they could have been. I'm not sure I really understand why Strauss went to such extent that he did to take down Oppenheimer. And so I thought that some of that wasn't really well brought out. And I thought that filmically, a couple of the fantasy scenes were over the top. When Oppenheimer thought, reimagined him having sex with his
yeah,
mistress
yeah.
right in the hearing room, that was just gross and
Yeah,
unnecessary.
that actually was what I was going to cite as the thing that I didn't like the best in the movie was
Yeah.
that was not really necessary and didn't not really that effective.
And
Um,
imagining his cheering team then being sort of subjected to a radiation nuclear
yeah,
winter
yeah,
meltdown, while instead of cheering, they were screaming with pain and horror. Uh, over the top, over the top.
yeah. I didn't mind that as much. Okay, so what do you think the movie's trying to accomplish here?
Oh, I think it was trying to dramatize a watershed moment in human history, and it did so you know, pretty damn well. I think that was pretty clear, and the moral quandary of the good and bad of developing the bomb, and also the contradictions within the scientists, their genius and their flaws, and what happens when you mix scientists who had a task in the science arena, mix them together with politics and with generals in war. So I thought that those were the key
Yeah,
issues and handled well.
yeah, no, I think you're right about that. I'd also say in the 60s, I'm sure you remember that we couldn't stop thinking about the bomb because we were all afraid of nuclear war. Now that we're 80 years into the nuclear age, it's actually more dangerous now than it was then. We hardly think about it at all. And when the movie says the bomb is destroyer of worlds, I thought it was a bit overwrought until I thought about it. I mean, I actually do live in real fear that a terrorist is going to detonate a bomb in New York City, or that there's an outdated silo in Russia that will accidentally launch a missile at us. So, although I think the primary purpose of the movie is to examine Oppenheimer's character, I think a secondary goal is to raise awareness about the power and threat of atomic bombs.
Yeah, I agree with that.
Let's talk about the actors. Cillian Murphy, completely unknown to me. He plays Oppenheimer. I'm surprised to find out he's Irish because he seems totally American. Apparently, he's been in several Christopher Nolan movies and is probably best known for the TV show Peaky Blinders, which I don't watch. So, again, this is someone else that's brand new to me. I assume that he's going to win Best Actor this year. Performance is excellent. Reminds me of Daniel Day-Lewis in Lincoln, this lanky, brooding Brit who seems more American than we are. What did you think of him?
Yeah, I thought he was excellent. I haven't seen, the other nominees, but I'd be shocked if he doesn't win the Oscar. He was on screen a lot
Yeah.
and in different with different personalities. And I just thought he did an excellent job. And once again, we've got well, it's not really UK actor because he's Irish,
Yeah. British
but
Isles.
we have a British. Thank you. We have a British Isles actor coming in to do the heavy lifting in an American film. But Nolan himself is really British.
Right. Yeah. He totally
So
is British. Yeah.
yeah, here we go again.
So, how about Robert Downey Jr.? What did you think about him?
I also thought he was great. It
He
was
plays Louis Strauss, by the way, the
yeah,
bad guy in the movie.
a great makeup job.
Great makeup job.
My
Great,
gosh.
amazing how they aged him, all these
Yeah.
characters, they really aged well.
Yeah, I thought he was really good too.
He's arguably the most financially successful actor of the last decade because of his Iron Man and Sherlock Holmes movies. Almost certain to win the Best Supporting Actor, and he deserves it. So I thought he did a great job. But Downey makes us, he's a real bad guy, and Downey makes us care about this confirmation fight. And you and I know people in Washington like this, right? The guys who love wielding power behind the scenes and will smile at you while they stick the knife in.
Yeah,
Example of
yeah.
this
It was
is
a
James Baker, for example.
What about
Um,
Emily Blunt?
yeah, she plays Oppenheimer's wife, Kitty. Weird. This is Oppenheimer's her fourth husband, so you gotta respect someone who feels confident enough to marry someone who's like 33 years old and and you're going to be her fourth husband. She's also nominated for Best Supporting Actress, but she has no chance of winning that. She plays the much put upon wife who takes the attacks against her husband much more than he does, much more seriously. She's perpetually holding a martini or looking like she needs one.
She also hates children.
She hates children, including her own.
And I tell you, the way kids were portrayed in this movie, I started to hate them too, because every time there was a scene, and there was a point being made in here, a scene with the kids, they were shrieking and screaming and misbehaving, and it gave me a headache. So, but my
Well,
reaction to her was, nah, I just I wasn't that impressed with her. It was probably the way the character was written,
yeah,
but I thought she was all over the map. And the first two-thirds of the movie, it was like she didn't really like her husband. And
yeah,
in the last third, she was suddenly the warrior who was the first, she was a Nancy Reagan type defender of
right,
um, of her
right.
husband. And I didn't understand the transition.
Yeah, yeah. I kind of get you there. I think a lot of it is the character is kind of unlikable and hard to understand. I mean, the fact that she doesn't like children is actually an important plot point in here because she's can't take care of the baby, so he has to take the baby to his friend's house, and they take care of
Right,
kind of a foster parents to this baby, and then it turns out this guy is just a spy, and not exactly a
right,
spy, but he has a conduit, and Oppenheimer gets trapped because he won't reveal who told him a certain bit of information, and because he's protecting his friend who took care of his baby. So
right,
her
right.
fault, all her fault. The wife, it's
Yeah.
always the wife's fault, right? In these movies.
And you
Um,
said it, not me. I thought my favorite acting in the movie was the interchanges between Matt Damon as the general,
yeah,
and Oppenheimer. I thought they had great chemistry
yeah.
together, and that's not always easy to accomplish. So I give a shout out to Matt Damon for the job he did in the movie. I always enjoyed watching their scenes together.
Yeah, I mean, who'd have guessed that in a movie about building the atomic bomb, that the funniest character would have been a lieutenant general in the U.S. Army? There's a reason that Matt Damon is a major movie star, and whenever he's in a scene in this movie, he really dominates it. I mean, he's great. And
Yeah.
he didn't get nominated.
I know, I was surprised, but maybe because
Well,
he still
Downey,
has, yeah,
uh,
and Damon still has too much of a an action hero image, which is not how he started.
yeah,
He started
yeah,
in a thoughtful movie. Um, I I have to give a non shout out to Josh Harnett,
okay,
who I thought was miscast and was not good. He played Ernest Lawrence, a brainiac nuclear scientist, and he just didn't look the part. I have nothing against Harnett, but it just was jarring to me.
got to mention our old friend Gary Oldman, who plays Truman. Um,
Yes,
he's our friend from The Darkest Hour, where he played Churchill. He's very good as the affable politician with a spine of steel. He's the opposite of Oppenheimer, who moans about his conscience, but Truman knows that to wield power is to make choices, some of which can conflict with your conscience. And he's the man who coined the phrase, if you can't stand the heat, get out of the kitchen. And he really lays into Oppenheimer when he says he feels like he has blood on his hands. He doesn't want to hear
Yeah.
that whiny stuff.
Yeah. I didn't like that scene. Are
Okay,
we
all right.
talking about that presidential scene now?
Yeah, all
Since
right, let's
you,
talk about the scene where he's president.
first of all,
Oh,
I
oh,
couldn't even recognize that it was Oldman. Oldman didn't have enough time to make much of an impression with me. I thought I actually thought he didn't sound that much like Truman. And I've heard Truman's real voice quite a bit. And I just thought I thought it was almost a throwaway scene and almost not really necessary because the movie was not about the Truman decision-making process to drop the bomb. The decision was conducted behind the scenes. And the movie was not about who was for dropping the bomb and who was against dropping the bomb. And it was not about the aftermath of all the times in the Eisenhower years when Eisenhower had to consider whether to use nukes. So I just thought it was gratuitous and didn't add much to the movie.
well, I thought, among other things, it showed a couple things about Oppenheimer's character. First of all, he's one of these guys. We know a lot of them. You've talked about this yourself, who talks a big deal, but then when he gets in front of the president, kind of wilts, and
Right,
and also it does distinguish, as I said before, you've got Truman, who knows what power really is and that you've got to make decisions, and sometimes you have to do things you don't want, and if you let yourself get consumed by second guessing, you're not going to be successful, compared to Oppenheimer, who's just obsessing about this. I think that it benefits from that, and I think it also benefits from showing you how Oppenheimer's reputation kind of started to fall into tatters when he was among the real people that had the power.
right,
And you're right, the movie is definitely not about the decision making, although you see what the decision making impact is upon on the scientists. You see them wrestling with it, and throughout the whole movie, they're all big shots, and they're doing this and then doing that, and then they make the bomb, and then the army comes in and says, "We'll take it from here, boys. Thank you very much." And they are completely out of the loop. They don't have any say in how it's going to happen, when it's going to happen. They're not even told when it's going to happen. The government doesn't take them seriously once they developed the bomb. So
right, right.
I just want to mention one more character. I got to mention that the Best Actor winner from 5 years ago is in this movie and appears for less than 5 minutes, and that's Rami Malek. He won the Oscar for Bohemian Rhapsody in 2019, and he plays a scientist who denounces Louis Strauss at the confirmation hearings. It's just weird that, that shows you the ephemerality of fame. I mean, a guy who is a big, big, most exciting day of his life just 5 years ago, and now he's got this teeny weeny little part in this movie.
Well, but I'm not really sure that's applicable, Gary, because one thing I kept thinking about while watching this movie is, wasn't it influenced by Oliver Stone's techniques to a degree?
Yeah,
I mean,
yeah.
for one thing, you had the length. Let's not forget the 3 hour
Yeah, right.
length, which is a Stone habit. You also had the switches from black and white to color. And so I thought that was an Oliver Stone touch. But to your point about Malik, you had in this movie quite a few big stars in relatively small parts, and that is an Oliver Stone
Hmm.
motif
Yeah,
in
yeah.
movies like JFK, where you had huge stars playing in small parts. So I don't know about the trajectory of Malik's career. I know he was the main villain in the last James Bond movie, which is a big,
Yeah,
that's a
big
big
part.
role.
Yeah.
And but I don't think the size of his part in this movie alone necessarily signifies anything.
Let's turn to the history or to the accuracy.
Sure.
So the movie's based on a very long and well-respected biography called American Prometheus. And I read someplace that this movie was the most accurate biopic ever made because it was so faithful to the facts. I didn't read the book, so I can't comment on that. What I found out during my high-powered Googling was that almost everything in the movie is true. Most of the dialogue is in two hearings, the hearing on Oppenheimer security clearance and the confirmation hearing. They come from the hearing transcripts themselves. So the core framework of the movie is accurate.
Yeah, I agree. I don't really have, from what I gleaned myself, I don't really have complaints about the details or the history. We've talked about what it leaves out
Yeah.
and why it leaves it out because it's a biopic about Oppenheimer. There's a lot of more interesting detail about the development and the dropping of the bomb that could have been, in their word, a different kind of movie. For one thing, and many people might assume otherwise, both General MacArthur and General Eisenhower were opposed to dropping the atomic bomb on Hiroshima. They thought the war, it was unnecessary, it was gratuitous. They didn't want the United States to be the first in history to do this, and that the Japanese were finished anyway. So that's interesting history that is not brought out in this movie. So mainly, if there's a historical gap in this movie, it's what's not in there.
Yeah.
And but believe me, we didn't need a longer than 3 hours movie. And as I said before, I do think it overinflated this idea of a security clearance being revoked being such a huge dramatic event in history or even in Oppenheimer's life.
Well, I mean, I specifically, my major historical challenge of the movie does actually go to that. Because the Senate, then the movie revolves around, or the last third of the movie revolves around Lewis Strauss, who had orchestrated Oppenheimer's security clearance revocation. He is up for Secretary of Commerce. But the Senate didn't refuse to confirm Strauss because of the way he treated Oppenheimer, although that was one issue that did come up. But this was pure power politics. Eisenhower had appointed Strauss to be Commerce Secretary just in advance of the 1958 elections, which the Democrats won overwhelmingly. So, with a big new majority, they were looking for a big political win, and they focused on Strauss, who had personally alienated many senators for being arrogant and condescending to them. Almost all the senators, all the Democrats voted no, and all the Republicans voted yes. And also, the idea that JFK was almost completely unknown senator is ridiculous. He was almost the Democratic nominee for vice president in 1956, and it was well known he was going to run for president. So,
Right.
so technically, everything they said about Oppenheimer and Strauss and the Rami Malek character, all that did happen. But you're right. What they've left out is just the bigger context. So he didn't really lose because of the way he treated Oppenheimer. He lost because the Democrats had won that election in between him being nominated and being confirmed. And plus they just people couldn't stand that guy's guts. I mean, he was apparently as obnoxious in real life as he's portrayed in the movie.
The last thing I would add about history, and this, frankly, they could have incorporated into their framework, was that there's a rather lengthy section in Eisenhower's own memoirs about this, the whole Oppenheimer security clearance issue. And Eisenhower says he believed from the beginning that there was no disloyalty on Oppenheimer's part, but that there were grounds to look into whether or not he should continue to have a security clearance because of some lies that he believed Oppenheimer had told in prior testimony. And he talks around this, and frankly, some personal volatility. I mean, the man had undergone psychiatric treatment and such, and could he be trusted with security secrets. And where Eisenhower comes down is he believes that a good compromise was struck. In other words, a result that made it clear that there was absolutely no grounds for accusing Oppenheimer of being a Russian agent or of being disloyal. And Eisenhower believes the result denied McCarthy of fodder for his red baiting. And in the final note that Eisenhower strikes, he says he felt sympathy for Oppenheimer because when Oppenheimer opposed the hydrogen bomb development and was accused of being pro-communist on that basis by some, Eisenhower said he flashed back to when he told Secretary of War Stimson that he, Eisenhower, was against dropping the bomb on Hiroshima. And Stimson was furious at Eisenhower and made Eisenhower feel really uncomfortable that he wasn't part of, quote unquote, the team. So, very nuanced treatment of this whole issue by Eisenhower, who was, after all, president when all these hearings were going on. So, that could have been somehow treated.
Yeah, this is not really part of the movie, as you say, but I did listen to a podcast about the dropping of the atom bomb when this movie came out last summer, and it said that there was actually no meeting at which they affirmatively decided to drop the bomb, that it was just assumed from the very beginning that it would be dropped. The question was when, where, and how, and of course, by the time Truman became president, he was, and it was in the car. The momentum was fast, So to not drop the bomb would have been almost impossible to stop, because
Yeah,
the momentum was so strong.
the McCullough biography of Truman bears you out on that, and concludes, sourced conclusions basically have Truman making a non-decision. In fact, Churchill's famous quote was, "The decision was that there was no decision," and everybody agreed that FDR, if he had lived a few more months, certainly would have dropped it.
Yeah, yeah. Okay,
So,
let's talk about our favorite scenes. What's yours? I would
sure.
probably have the same favorite scene, but go ahead.
Well, my favorite scene by far was the whole scene of the successful test.
Right, right.
And it was so good cinematically. Just it was breathtaking, it was dramatic. The music and the pulsating beat of the music leading up to the actual setting off of the device was super. The finger on the button to abort gave it a real suspense. The tragic or interesting irony of having perhaps Mother Nature be the one to stop the test. In other words, bad weather,
Right.
stopping this huge violation of Mother Nature, the splitting of the atom test. I just thought it was so, so good.
I agree. I agree. And the movie making that goes into that was astonishing because,
Yes.
like, for example, you feel this especially in the IMAX theater. The blast goes off and you see it go off 3 or 4 miles away, but it's quiet, right? There's no sound at all.
Heartbeats. You hear some heartbeats and
Heartbeats,
breathing.
a couple birds chirping, and you wonder, is there something wrong with the projector or something like that? I mean, what's going on here? And then you realize, oh, it's going to take a while for the sound to get to you. And then when it comes, it's like really, really powerful. So yeah, this is a strange scene to mention, I guess, but there's a montage at the beginning of the movie that shows how modernism emerged after World War One in the 1920s. So you see modern art, you hear modern music, you see modern architecture and design, and it demonstrates how scientific advances, including quantum physics, was changing the way people perceive the world as a more abstract, disjointed, disorienting place. So even though this movie is about World War II, it also shows the what the impact of World War One in basically changing the world and making it into a modern world.
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah, I liked the scene where he was over in, I guess, the Netherlands,
Yeah.
and he was going to give a lecture and just suddenly started speaking fluent Dutch.
Yeah.
I thought that was and shocking his audience. And I just thought it was nice to see some scenes like that. Of course, it also hinted at his arrogance and precociousness.
Right.
I
Right.
like that scene. And
Any
then the
scene with
scene,
Matt and Damon, any scene with Matt Damon, is
yes,
great. Okay.
yeah,
I'm sorry. What were
yeah,
you going to say?
yeah. And then the scene of the excitement when the Germans first split the atom, and word had reached the scientists in America that this had been done, and how it evoked both the excitement and the competitiveness of scientists before they even settled into thinking about the ramifications. I like that scene too.
And it's hard to say that I like this scene, but it's very I thought it was very impactful. The scene where Oppenheimer speaks to the Los Alamos staff when after the bomb is dropped is the best example of how Oppenheimer doesn't really know his own mind. He treats this like a couple 100,000 people have just been incinerated, and he treats it like a political rally. And he reacts exuberantly to the staff stamping their feet rhythmically. He even says that he wishes they developed the bomb sooner so they could have dropped it on Germany, which, if you think about it, is a very grotesque thing to say. And then later, so he gets caught up in the moment of the exuberance of this, but then later he like, oh, he's crying and like, oh, this is a terrible thing that I did and all that kind of stuff.
Yeah, yeah,
All right. How about any favorite lines? What's your There's so many. This is one of these movies with so many lines, it's hard to pick one. So
yeah. I liked the one where I think it was Oppenheimer when told that the Nazis, were far ahead of the Americans so far in developing the atomic bomb. He said, "Well, we've got just one hope in terms of catching up, and that is anti-Semitism."
yeah,
That in other words, it was the Nazis' anti-Semitism would keep. They'd be so distracted by that they wouldn't let their genius Jewish scientists have free reign to develop a weapon that could actually win them the war. I like that one.
yeah. I mean, the probably the best known sequence is when Matt Damon says, "Are you saying there's a chance that when we push the button we will destroy the world?" Oppenheimer says, "The chances are near zero." Near zero. Well, what do you want from theory alone? And he says zero would be nice.
That was great.
Yeah.
And then Oppenheimer said, "I don't know if we can be trusted with such a weapon, but I know the Nazis cannot. We have
Yeah.
no choice."
Oppenheimer's wife, he confesses at, after he confesses to her that he had an affair with this again communist, um, and he's all upset. And she says, "You don't get to commit sin and then ask us all to feel sorry for you when there are consequences." Um,
Yeah.
Apply for many times in life in general, not just
Yep.
that.
Yeah. I liked when the German scientist Bohr said, "It's not a new weapon; it's a new world."
Yeah,
It's
yeah.
kind of
Well,
obvious,
also,
but that's the theme.
yeah. Well, Niels Bohr also says algebra is like sheet music. The important thing isn't that you can read music; it's that you can hear it. Now, I don't know what that means, but it sounds good.
Right? As
But in the
does,
movie, I wrote it down and I was like, "Wait a second, what does that mean
yeah,
anyway?"
as does the line about the destroyer of worlds
Yeah,
that
yeah,
we've already referred to, and the line you mentioned already, which was one of my favorites, when the military guys looked up at Oppenheimer and said, "We'll take it from here,"
yeah,
after the weapon was developed. And that was kind of chilling.
yeah, yeah. It sure was. Tells you who's in charge.
Yep.
Okay, let's talk about the relevance of this movie today. A lot of times when we're doing this, we're talking about a movie that was made 20 years ago. And, is the movie still relevant? This was made just last year, so it's still it hasn't dated. It's not dated at all. But what do you think its relevance is to?
Well, I think it's hugely relevant to today. The issues are hugely relevant, put aside that it's a recent movie. The whole issue of nuclear weaponry is still with us.
Yeah.
Proliferation, to what degree can we have international cooperation to limit, weaponry? I think the whole issue of I kept thinking about AI
Mm-hmm.
during
Yep.
this movie. In other words, what are the unintended consequences? What about they talked about setting the atmosphere on fire? Very thoughtful people have conjured up similar circumstances with when AI is triggered and goes out of control and basically takes actions that can just threaten the whole world and threaten
Including taking
civilization.
over an atomic weapons system. I mean, if you
Right.
put Oppenheimer together with AI, then you've got, I mean, yeah, something really to worry about.
Yeah. And finally, on the more social front, I would say two relevancies. First, we could do well to remember that the reminder in this movie that scientists are not pure,
Right.
that they can have agendas, that they can be caught up in conventional wisdom and conventional thinking. Because this was a whole debate during COVID and climate change. How dare you challenge the scientists when the scientists can be just as caught up in fadism as anybody else and in ideology? So I think that's relevant. And finally, the idea that you can be accused of disloyalty or shilling for another country simply because you disagree with a mainstream policy approach. So anybody who's against funding the war in Ukraine is a stooge of Putin,
Well,
blah,
they
blah,
are, but
blah.
yeah, okay.
Yeah,
Yeah.
I know you think that, but I think you should take instruction from this movie and that maybe anyone who didn't jump on the hydrogen bomb bandwagon or repel efforts to have an international control of these weapons was a Soviet spy. Those would be what I would say.
All right. So I agree with you on all of that. Although we disagree on Ukraine specifically. I would say I'll just add one small thing to that. A lot of the best movies that we've watched about presidential power revolve around the question of compromise and a sense of being willing to give up some of your moral principles to achieve a greater good. In this case, we have a character who's self-indulgent to a tremendous degree and more than a little morally compromised. He cheats on his wife at least twice that we know of, lies to a lot of people, quakes when faced with people with real power, and is more than a little power hungry. And the reason this is relevant is that you don't need to be a traditional hero to accomplish something important, but it also shows you that you really can't put anyone on a pedestal, right? Very few people who accomplish anything are saints. Now, Oppenheimer was definitely not a saint. He accomplished something important. And it's just we should be grown up about these things and not be hero worshipers. Okay.
Agreed.
Okay. Who'd you recommend this movie to?
Basically, anyone who doesn't go to films just for escapism
Yeah.
and just for fantasy entertainment,
Yeah.
but wants a movie that's interesting, very exciting in some places, dramatic, but deals with serious issues without turning it into a graduate seminar.
Yeah. 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 Also, anyone who knows anything about physics, also World War II buffs, students of history in general, Christopher Nolan fans, because this is really peak Nolan. If you think about it, this actually is quite a large range of audience for this movie, and I'm glad that so many people went out to see it.
Yeah, I haven't had a chance yet to ask my brother if he's
Oh,
ever seen it. My younger brother is a nuclear physicist, trained at MIT, and worked for many years in Los Alamos. Recently retired, and I haven't had a chance to ask him yet, but I will.
I know, and maybe you'll even send him this podcast to see how smart you
Hey,
are.
that's a good idea.
And we can get one extra viewer, a listener, I should say. All right. So if you were a high school teacher, would you assign this movie?
Absolutely. And let me tell you a little anecdote there. A couple of years ago, I took a community college
Yeah.
history course on modern American history. And one of the discussion sessions we had was about whether it was right for the United States to develop and then drop the nuclear bomb. And almost all the students were 18 to 20-year-olds, except for me, obviously. And it was clear there was some large gaps of knowledge, but still most students thought that we had to do it. We had to drop it, but they didn't know any of the details. And they didn't know any of the debates that went into that. And um, one student thought that it was appalling that the United States would take an action that killed civilians
Uh-huh.
and had to be apprised of the fact that the wanton bombing of civilians was par for the course in World War II on all sides, including the Tokyo firebombing that caused more deaths than Hiroshima. And another student said, it's too bad that we rendered those areas where we dropped the bombs forever uninhabitable, and had to be told that Hiroshima and Nagasaki are bustling, modern, thriving cities today. So I think for a lot of reasons, that young people could really benefit from watching this movie. And the language and the sex scenes, I think, are fleeting enough that an exception could be made.
If I were a high school teacher, I would make sure that my students were 18 though, just because of the sex scenes and the other things. Although I don't know, what is R-rated? Is it 17 or 18 now? I used to care about this, but now I don't.
I'm not sure. I'm not
But
sure what
whatever
it
the
is.
R-rated level is, I would make sure I got to that.
It's
All right.
really too bad because the sex scenes could have easily been handled with suggestiveness
Yeah.
and not graphic
Yeah.
depictions.
Okay.
It's too bad.
Grading the movie. What's your grade?
A minus, and may there forever be more movies like this and a few less superhero and sequels coming out of Hollywood.
I would give it an A. I actually thought Barbie was a better movie, but I won't complain if this wins Best Picture because, I'm sure they'll be talking about this movie for decades. All right. So
Does that mean you would give Barbie an A plus?
No, I'd give it an A too. I'd give it an
Okay.
A.
All right.
Yeah.
I haven't seen it yet. I
Yeah.
will.
Yeah. It's a totally different kind of movie. And it's not as overtly serious. In fact, it's a comedy, but it has very serious themes. Anyway, all right. So we've come to the end of another exciting podcast here. And I just want to remind everybody that the podcast is available on Apple, Spotify, Amazon, and most podcast platforms. So you can subscribe there. Also going to encourage people, if they have movies that they want us to watch that have presidents in them, to let us know. And we will be back in a couple of weeks with another presidential movie. You have any final words, Jim?
And the suggestions can be fiction or non-fictional. And the role of the president does not necessarily have to be the central role.
No, it doesn't. I mean, obviously, Truman is in this movie for 2 minutes. So as I said, let us know what movie you'd like us to watch, and we'll see you next time. Bye-bye.
Let's go recruit some scientists. Build a town, build it fast. If we don't let scientists bring their families, we'll never get the best.
Why would we go to the middle of nowhere for who knows how long?
Why? How about because this is the most important thing to ever happen in the history of the world?
You're the great improviser, but this you can't do in your head.
What are we saying? There's a chance that when we push that button, we destroy the world. Chances are near zero. Near zero. What do you want from theory alone? Zero would be nice.